Now, when you have questions, questions are welcome at all times. If they're not, I'll let you know. But most of the time, questions are welcome. But when you ask a question, I will repeat the question, so the question is recorded. I won't repeat it in your name, but I'll repeat it. Hopefully I'll know your name soon, but I won't repeat the questions in your name. So, now we're going to go, here we go. Okay. If you want to use the slides, so you'll be able to find this. The first thing in the reader is the syllabus, and after that, you'll see the reading for this session. The reading for this session is poorly reproduced, and it will be reproduced again as soon as I find the way to do it, and then you'll have a more readable copy. You probably haven't read the reading for this session, and if you can try to do it before the next session. Each unit is two classes. What we're going to do is spend the first class of each unit learning directly, like this, and then the second class of each unit, we're going to spend 1 hour talking and 1 hour doing an exercise. And the exercise will be designed, you'll have time to do it, there'll be a whole hour, and you'll be able to sort of get to know each other and start to work on how these things apply to your neighbors and to yourselves. The idea is to learn about our families. As we think about families, the family that's closest to you is your own. And some of you share a family, so that'll be more interesting. So we want to be always thinking, back to what does it say about me. When we do the exercise, the women will stay here, and the men will come with me to my office, and we'll do the exercise there. Okay? So we're going to start with a family, but it's a family that was treated not by a family therapist, because this happened in Vienna at around the beginning of the 1900s, and there weren't any family therapists. As a matter of fact, for another 50 years there weren't going to be family therapists. Therapy started blind to families, and the person who started all of this is a gentleman named Sigmund Freud, who you've probably heard about, but my guess is in your master's programs that none of you have ever read a word that he wrote. Am I right? Anybody read Freud in the master's program? Yeah? In the master's program?
In my last master's program.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, so you're the expert. Everything's relative. Freud, as you know, was treating adults, and there were no boundaries. When things get started, it's very hard to have boundaries. So there was a lot of overlap between the people who were coming for treatment for Freud and people who were studying in his very small Wednesday evening circle where they were trying to create psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis didn't start out as a big thing. It began as a very small thing, and as a matter of fact, it was under a lot of pressure, which we would call anti-Semitic pressure. Freud was very desperate to try to get his ideas out, not just among Jews, because his ideas were a little bit radical. And the first thing that people did in Vienna in those days is if they didn't like something, they said it was Jewish. And Freud was Jewish. His Hebrew name is Shlomo ben Yaakov. And he's named after a grandfather who died just before he was born in 1856. And if you need to quote Freud in places where people are not friendly to Freud, then Shlomo ben Yaakov, Freud, can be translated as Harash Bisason. And so that's a way to slip in some Freudian ideas. If you need, you just say Harash Bisason. So far, no one has ever admitted that they've never heard of Harash Bisason. So that's Freud. Freud started to treat young people, but not children. And one of his close associates, somebody who was in treatment with him, the wife was in treatment with him, they were both in training with him. This sounds like, oh my God, you would never do that? Not today, but that's how things start, small. This couple had a child named Hans, and Hans became neurotic. Now, Freud was talking to people who were at least usually 18 and 20, and sometimes older. And he would try to reproduce in his imagination, through dreams and through all sorts of hints. Freud saw himself sort of like Sherlock Holmes. That was his favorite literary figure. That he would be like a detective, and he would get these hints, and he could reconstruct what happened to you when you were 2 or 3. And suddenly, he has this close association with his family who has a kid who's 2 or 3. And indeed is, as Freud thought, proving all of his theories. Now, you can see the circle right away. And so this is not exactly science. It's what's called, and psychoanalysis has always been what's called poetic science. It's not, it doesn't work. You can't use tools of statistics. You can't break everything apart and then have the computer solve it for you. You have to sort of put it together yourself as a person. So it's a poetic science. And Freud was a bit of a madman. He was a very good scientist, but he was quite a madman. And so he decided he was going to go after this kid, and he was going to treat this kid. So here's little Hans. Now, since we're now family therapists, you know, from this moment on, you're family therapists, more and more every day. So here's a genogram, and here's the father, and here's the mother. Hans is the older brother, and he has a sister named Hannah. Hans becomes neurotic not long after Hannah is born. He's 3.5 when she's born, and then he starts to get a phobia at a 1.5 years later. And the phobia is he's afraid of horses. It's the Vienna in like 1903. There aren't any cars. So there are horses. There's a horse station outside his window, and he can't go out of his home because he's afraid that the horses are going to stomp on him. Now, phobia, that's a neurosis. That's what people were coming to Freud to treat. And here we have a 3-year-old. So Freud decided that he knew what this meant. Now, you'll see very shortly that 30 years later, Freud was able to say, you never know what something means. So we're going to look at Freud trying to know what something means, stumbling over it, and gradually we're going to learn how to unpack this term, what something means, okay? So here's Hans, and he has this fear of horses, and now Freud is going to try to see what it means. Freud's first idea was that it's an expression of a drive. What are drives? Do you know what? Anybody speak to you about drives in your masters? It's sort of like Alta Sachen, but live and well in all of us. Just a question if you want to look at them. The drives are the things that you don't know are pushing you, but they're pushing you, right? And the drives tend to be bodily. They're at the interface between your body and your thinking. And the two major drives that are at the interface of your thinking and your body are sexual drives and aggressive drives, right? Yeah.
Just to clarify the drives, you're saying there are things that we are not aware of?
Yeah, not aware. Not aware. Not aware. Freud's first idea was that we're not aware of very much. That probably is true even if you do CBT. In other words, if you do CBT, you deal only with what you're aware of. And you say, those are things that are, first of all, more direct. They're more accessible because you're aware of them. You can manipulate them because you can talk about them. There's language to it. Then the question is, what part of the whole human being is that? And the answer in CBT is the part that we're interested in. That's all. It's a circle. In other words, once you decide that that's what you're certain about, you're interested in, so you only deal with what's conscious. Freud tried to deal with what was conscious, and it just didn't work. And he discovered early on that when people told him things and said, what? I said that? I didn't realize I had that idea. That's what seemed to help people to recover. This idea that there's something that you didn't know that then you recover. So has that ever happened to any of you? I mean, all of the people sitting in here who are millennials in the 21st century have no unconscious. It's been wiped out. Has it ever happened to you that it occurred to you on Tuesday something about yourself that you didn't know on Monday? Right? It happens. So what was going on Monday? Well, that's what we call the unconscious. There were things about ourselves. If you think about consciousness, you can hold very, very little of what's going on in the outside world in consciousness. I certainly can't hold all of you all at once in consciousness. I doubt that you can hold everything that's going on here in consciousness. And if that's true of the outside world, it may well be true of the inner world, of the things that that happened to you in the past, the things that you remember, and the things that are pushing along in your body, like sometimes what's referred to as the Yetzer Hara, things like that. The Yetzer Hara is considered to be unconscious. It wasn't Freud's idea. If you're aware of it, it's something different. As you know, if we say, what do you do when you have a Yetzer Hara? You take it to base medrash. What does that mean? What base medrash you bring it to? You make it conscious, right? They can't bring something to the base medrash that's not conscious. The base medrash is a place of things that are conscious. So Freud was dealing with things that perhaps Hans wasn't aware of, and he was saying, well, why would this kid be afraid of horses? He'd never had an experience where he saw a horse do anything bad, not to him and not to anybody. So where could it be coming from? So his first idea is that it's coming from inside of him, and it's an aggression. And where might this aggression be coming to? So if we go back to the family, and we say, some of you have little children, right? When Hans's sister was born, that's a mixed blessing, fair to say? In other words, children are very happy to have a new sibling, kind of, sort of, some of the time. And some of the time, when they have a new sibling, that's not so easy for them. Who was the first person who taught us that? Freud, right? So after we learned from Freud what might happen, so for the century after that, we're aware that a child who has a new sibling may want to get rid of that sibling, right? And some of you who are laughing may have had children who, when their younger sibling was born, said, that's very nice, Mommy, now take him back to the hospital, right? And may have given the new child hugs that seemed like they were going to strangle him. And if you asked the kid, are you trying to strangle your sister? Hans would say, me? Conscious? Me? Me is conscious. But it seems that my body is doing something different. So, so Freud had the idea that maybe Hans wanted to get rid of his sister. And one of the reasons he might want to get rid of his sister is, who did his sister take away from him? His mother, right? Mommy's busy with the new baby. That's what mommies do, right? You've all been through it. The mommies are preoccupied. That's Winnicott's term. They're preoccupied with babies. They can't stop thinking of, and why can't they stop thinking about the baby? Because that's what the baby needs. The baby can't take care of itself. So you create a unit where mother is preoccupied and is always thinking, you know, unhappy, dirty, hungry, unhappy, dirty, but always thinking what could be. And even if the baby's quiet, mothers are usually thinking, and some fathers are thinking, what's going to happen next, right? Maybe I should get ready to something, whether fall asleep and the baby wakes you up. And you say, well, I have a preoccupation here. So we assume that Hans's mother became preoccupied with somebody other than Hans, right? That's not a difficult story to tell. It, for some reason, is out of the scope of what's taught these days in psychology. In other words, there's no CBT for that, and so it's kind of ignored. But the babies the little children have a hard time when their siblings are born. So Freud thought that Hans probably wants his mother, and he may feel that the person taking away his mother is his father, because his father seems to have something to do with the new baby. And so he might want to get rid of his father, right? Now, this isn't, you know, this isn't literature. What's it called in literature? Oedipus. Oedipus. That's a new story, Oedipus? How old is the story of Oedipus?
A long time.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. It's bias rishon, as we say. In other words, the Havdil. Oedipus is a very, very old myth, which was put into writing in the 400s by the Greek dramatist Sophocles, but not only there. It had other expressions. The one that's preserved for us is, anybody read Sophocles with three plays of Oedipus, right? So Oedipus himself kind of didn't know that he was killing his father when he was killing him. And Freud went back to this and said, well, this is a myth, and so it probably expresses something about all of us. Maybe we all want to do something like that in some way, and we're not aware of it. And maybe that's why Hans is afraid of horses. Now, how would we get from father to horses? We would need some hints, and so Freud went looking like the usual Sherlock Holmes way. This is, by the way, a case called Little Hans, which I didn't put in the reader because I thought no one was going to read it. But if you want to read it, it's a fascinating case. You know, it's Freud at his wildest speculation. And so Freud says, listen, you know, Hans wants his mother, and he wants to get rid of his father. And all of this is because of his baby sister. That's a possibility. So what did Freud do? He said, oh, what do? We make the unconscious conscious. That's what you do in psychoanalysis. That's what was happening. That was like the cutting edge, you know, that's the nice in 1900, that this actually made people better. You were going to ask something? What was your name?
Allie.
Yeah.
Is the Oedipus complex only with regards to a little boy feeling that way about his mother, or it could be a girl and her mother?
Right. Oedipus was a boy. So the Oedipus complex, the one named after him is for boys, and the one named after Electra. Right. It's the same idea, though. In other words, boys don't have a patent on messing things up inside their emotional worlds. They're better at it than girls, but they don't have a patent. Girls can do it too. So sure.
What I meant is, like, let's say a little girl has a new little sister. So does she feel the same way, like she wants to get rid of the little sister because of her mom? Or is that mostly a boy thing?
How did you know to ask that question? The question is, well, but it's different for girls. And indeed it's different for girls, and it led Freud to a horrible mistake. He decided that, the boy is losing his, what? Yeah, the question was, how are girls different? The boy is attached to his mother, and then he sees his father is taking the mother away. The girl has more trouble becoming aggressive towards her mother because she still needs her mother. And as a result, Freud said, it looks like girls don't internalize, you know, because the voice of the father who says, no, you're not going to do that, that's where your conscience comes from, according to Freud. That's the voice of no, right? So boys, you know, you try to hack it out with your dad, and they give you a serious no, and after a little while you get the hang of it, and you say, okay, I can do that too, I can say no to myself. Girls don't do that with their father, and so they don't have a good conscience. That's a horrible mistake, but that's where your question comes from. That's how people thought in 1900. Nobody thinks that way now. No Freudian thinks that way now. But the fact that it's different, it's different. What the results are, you don't want to be too simple-minded. As you see, what happens with Freud is that things are both very complex and a little simple-minded, right? So Freud said, I think I know what's going on with this boy. He wants to take his mother away from his father, and he can't do it. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. And so who says it's dangerous? The desire to take mom away from dad and get rid of this Hannah, is that, how do you know it's dangerous? Who knows it's dangerous? Is the noting that it's dangerous at the same place inside of us that I want it? I want to do this, and I know it's dangerous in the same place? No. Different places, conflict. So Freud said that there's a conflict between the drives, this nasty thing we were just talking about, natural and nasty, and the fact that it's dangerous. So the ego, that's me. That's the one who knows something about the outside world and has language and can think, right? Says, listen, buddy, this is not a good idea. So how about if we diminish it? How about if we restrain that wish? So the first conflict is going to be between the drives and the relationship of the ego to the drives, right? So the boy is able to look around and he doesn't see any other kids in his gun killing their father. And he may have heard that it's not a good idea. And he actually loves his father as well, because it's conflicted. So he says something to himself. You see, the desire doesn't say anything, because it doesn't use language. There's no thinking to it. But the ego responds to it and says, that's not a great idea. So now we have a compromise. Now, how would that work? We have a conflict, and the ego makes a compromise between the world and the drives. What's the compromise? Instead of being afraid that your father's going to get back at you for wanting to get rid of him, horses are dangerous. In other words, you use your literary talents. You become a poet, right? You make a metaphor. You say, it's not really dad that's dangerous to me, it's horses. And as a matter of fact, who do you tell that the horses are dangerous? Your father. And so your father ends up protecting you from yourself. Pretty good, no? In other words, all you need to do is be afraid of horses. And look at this marvelous, complicated compromise that you've been able to create. So when we look at the inner world, we say, we can do some pretty amazing things there. And we do it automatically. In other words, if Hans could say to himself, I would rather not be afraid of that. I would rather be afraid of horses. That won't work, because you can't make those compromises in the same place where you're thinking. The compromise is made between thinking and between things that are not thinking. So all compromises are unconscious, right? They're done between the ego and the Oedipal wish we're talking about, but it's done in a way that Hans doesn't know that that's the compromise. He has no idea that horses have anything to do with his father, okay? Even though he's made the compromise, but he hasn't made it on purpose. He's made it automatically. So it looks like there's an ability inside the poet in all of us to really mess things up, right? In other words, instead of solving this, to mess it up, to turn it into horses and then make a whole big scene about horses. Yeah?
Can you repeat why it wouldn't work to do it consciously?
What's that?
Can you repeat why it wouldn't work to do it consciously?
Right, because if I could hold the whole thing in consciousness, I could say, well, cut it out. You know, I would say to myself what the adult would say to the child, say, you know, get over it. What kind of nonsense is this? Your father doesn't hate you, he's not going to, just figure it out. Well, then there's no compromise, right? When you make a compromise, you're not ready to let go of it. You're not completely aware of what it is. The ego is pushing against it, but without full seichel, right? We're not really in a fully formulated thinking, talking. We're in something that's before thinking and talking, so it sort of happens automatically. So Hans creates his own Neurosis, right? In other words, who created this compromise? Dad? No. Freud? No. Hans. Inside of us, we're able to make these compromises and to not know it. And then suddenly we're afraid of something. You know, in Jerusalem, not too many people are afraid of horses these days, but you know, depending on the security situation, there's lots of other things to be afraid of. So you can make this compromise, and the important part of the compromise is that it drives your life, but you don't understand it, right? And so therefore, Freud, in his simple way, said, listen, bring your kid to me, bring him to me, I'll solve the problem for him. So the father brings Hans to Freud, and there's this hilarious scene where Freud doesn't exactly, he had 6 children, but he didn't know how to talk in the room with the kid, and so he said, listen, Hans, what you want, children have wanted way before you. This is something that happens to children. See, we're going to like language and thinking, and we're going to make this compromise into something that's understandable, and then it'll go away, because it won't be necessary anymore, because he'll understand. You know, boys have always wanted to get to compete with their fathers and to get mom back, and before you were born, that's happened a lot of times. And so now we're going to make what was unconscious conscious, and then we don't need the compromise. Well, what do you think the results were? First of all, there's a hilarious result that the boy leaves and says to his father, does the doctor, the professor, that's what they call it, does the professor talk to God? See, because the professor was acting a little like God, in the sense that he knows things that nobody else knows. So that wasn't a compliment. Freud says that's probably an insult. You know, that's not my role here. But what the boy meant is he didn't listen to me. He didn't help me to do anything. He just gave me the answer, but he didn't bring me to my answer. So how's that supposed to help, right? That's the big question now in the limitations of CBT, which is when you give the answer, how does that produce a process of getting to answers? So, so Freud's first psychoanalysis of 4-year-old Hans was a dismal failure, and then he went back to the drawing board. Now, what kind of drawing board could we go back to? After all, we only have one compromise. So over the next 30 years, Freud and his colleagues developed a more complicated map. So far, we got the first part of the map, the drives, the ego, okay? There's 3 more parts to the map. There's the superego. Now, what is the superego? The superego at 4, what's that?
Morality.
Is morality. It's the voice of no, right? Now, the superego, just so you don't mess up terms, superego is not the same as conscience. Superego is a set of 2 functions, one of which is conscience. Conscience is no, right? The other function of the superego is yes. That's what's called the ego ideal. What do I want to be like, right? What do I don't want to do? And what do I want to be like? And so here we're dealing with the superego in the sense of conscious, the voice of no. The voice of yes we'll be getting to as we go along. It's a very important family function, the voice of yes. Like, who do you want to be like? How do you want to be? But right now we're talking about no. And so let's say that Hans has another bit of a problem, which is he tells himself, no, that's bad, you're bad, and you need to be punished. Oh, so now Hans is becoming a complicated little boy, right? But you talk to 4-year-olds, they're pretty complicated. So the 4-year-old is saying, there's something that is driving me to do something, and it's bad, and I'm bad, and I need to be punished. Now, in a 4-year-old's way of thinking, what is a punishment? Is it going to your room? The way a 4-year-old thinks of it. Adults think about, you know, go to your room, turn off the whatever machine you're using. What is a 4-year-old's view of punishment? Pretty serious. It's bodily, it's physical, and it's usually death or something like that. In other words, physical harm. You can imagine that the idea of physical harm, that's what boys are afraid of. They're afraid of physical, girls too. What?
I'm just confused. A 4-year-old, let's say, like my daughter is 4 years old.
Say that again, and then I'll repeat it.
An idea of being punished is to be physically harmed?
Well, first of all, in 1900 in Vienna, all children were hit. So that's what children were used to. And the reason that they stopped being hit was because of Freud, right? In other words, people started to realize what that does to kids, and so they changed it. But all kids were being hit. But it's natural for kids to think in extremes. Kids have trouble thinking, you know, is it really bad, or only a little bad, or so much bad?
I think that a 4-year-old's mind wouldn't even go there.
Sorry?
I would think that a 4-year-old's mind wouldn't even go there.
Wouldn't go to physical punishment?
Wouldn't go to something so bad because they don't have nothing. I'm saying, like, I feel like they're so innocent in a way. They don't have something so, they don't know of such bad things to, like, reflect their mind to
right.
Go to.
So the question is, what kind of Bubba-Meises we're telling here. 4-year-olds don't go to extremes. 4-year-olds would be, why would they go to extremes? But the answer is, if you look at, if you play with 4-year-olds, that's what I do for a living, and if you talk to 4-year-olds, not your 4-year-olds, your 4-year-olds are exempt, but all the other 4-year-olds, you see that they think in extremes. In other words, they can't think in the middle. They think in extremes.
No, but you don't know. Like, let's say I'm just doing, my daughter's almost 4, so that time you can encourage it just because in my mind, she doesn't know of anything so bad, let's say. So she has nothing to like, why would that come up in her mind?
4-year-old girl.
Extremes in other ways.
Right.
But things that she knows of that she...
Right. See, this is...
a word that I can't think of.
Well, no, it's an important question. It's a 21st century question. 4-year-old girls in Jerusalem, 2019, Tafshin Pei, live a sort of protected life. Like, where do they see death? Why would they think of anybody dying? That wasn't the case in 1900. The infant mortality up to the age of 2 was 50%. And so everybody had experienced a loss of a sibling, and usually loss of God knows how many relatives as well. In other words, people lived at the edge of the graveyard. After penicillin and reasonable nutrition, we live a different life. And we live a privileged life. If you look at 9/10 of the world, that's how it is. In other words, those kinds of things were around. Now, your girl is privileged enough that she wouldn't think that, but the neighbor's girl might have had the experience of an animal dying, or hearing about a car accident, or whatever, and it might occur to her. But the main thing is the children tend to think as far to the extreme as they can. Right? And so Hans is likely to say to himself, this is not just a little bad. There isn't any a little bad. When you talk to boys, you help them to say it's only a little bad. They can participate in that talk. But in their own mind, it's not a little bad, it's just bad. Yeah?
So just to clarify that point about the punishment, so we're suggesting this is when we tell a 4-year-old that you're going to get a punishment, they go to the extreme of it's going to something like I have a fear now, an extreme fear.
Right, unless you help them to mitigate it. The 21st century parents help them to mitigate it. In Vienna in 1900, parents said to the kids, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to cut that off. That's what they said to the kids. You had a question?
No, I was just thinking some kind of like death, you can think of it like metaphors.
Right, talk a little louder.
In terms of like, it can be also metaphorical, not like dafka death, if it's not applicable to the child's work, but something very terrible.
Right.
Like, just metaphorical.
Okay, so I think I heard you enough. In other words, thinking about getting rid of your father, that's pretty terrible, right? So you can think that the punishment is going to be like getting rid of you, right? So, so the superego is more harsh. In other words, when we say there's a no, the natural no of children tends to extremes. It tends to be more extreme. And then what do adults do? Instead of telling them how bad it's going to be, they have to help them to see that it's not going to be so bad. In other words, it's going to be bearable, because the child himself is thinking to the extremes. So if the child is thinking, I'm in danger here, right, from dad, and something terrible could happen to me, and then he needs to make a compromise with the superego. In comes the ego and says, you're exaggerating, because the ego can think about it, has language, and says, well, no one's going to kill you, but the ego is saying this, and the kid doesn't know how to make the compromise. So what compromise do you have? Instead of being afraid of dad doing you in, you're afraid of horses, right? It's not so bad. You just, a horse is dangerous to you. So you see that the compromise now is a double compromise. You see that? In other words, I made a situation, so a double compromise means you're already a pretzel, right? In other words, it's too good. Once you have horses, suddenly you don't have to know what you want, and you don't have to know what you're afraid of. All you can have to do is be afraid of horses. That's pretty good. In other words, this is sort of the brilliance of what's called the neurotic solution. A neurotic solution is compromises that you don't make. They make themselves, and when they make themselves in this way that it's good that you're no longer trying to kill dad, and you're no longer afraid dad's going to kill you, but it ain't so good because you don't know why you're afraid of horses, and neither does dad, right? You had a question?
I just want to clarify. The dichotomous thinking that happens in children is a result of a compromise between the ego and the superego?
Is what the result?
Is the lack of compromise between the ego and the superego? I mean to say, once the ego kicks in,
Yeah.
they could see the gray area.
No. See, if the ego it can solve it, the ego would say, "Get out of here." You know, nothing's going to happen. But the ego is immature. So what the ego can do is seek a compromise, and the compromise happens by itself. And so the child isn't able to say to themselves, "Listen, here's the deal. I don't really want to get rid of Dad. I want to be afraid of horses. Here's the deal. I'm not really afraid Dad's going to get rid of me. I'll be afraid of horses. That's the deal." That cannot happen, because once you're putting it into language and thinking, it's not an unconscious compromise. See, the ego has been able to solve the problem. The ego is like a half solution, which becomes another problem. Right? In other words, when we look at what are called neurotic symptoms, we say that it's an attempt at a solution,
Like Band-Aiding.
but an unsuccessful attempt. It creates another problem instead. What's that?
It's like Band-Aiding in a way.
Say?
It's sort of Band-Aid.
It's a
Band-Aid. Part of
The
that.
band.
No, it's not a Band-Aid. If it would be a Band-Aid, life would
But
be
it's
easier.
not good, you say.
Right,
It's not a problem.
it's
in a way, it like covers it up.
You see, but a Band-Aid doesn't create another problem.
Right. It's a
Right?
Band-Aid creates a
A
problem.
Band-Aid is a way of not knowing, of putting something out of sight and keeping it clean. Here, you create another problem. It's like, you know, I have this cut here, and I need to use my hand, so I think I'll have a cut here instead. What kind of a solution is that? It's a partial solution. It solves this one, but it creates another one. So that's what happens with children. They create neuroses because the ego is incapable of a complete solution, and it settles for a partial solution, which creates another problem, a metaphorical problem. Horses, yeah.
So this, I don't know if you're gonna get to it or whatever, but like, what type is horses? Why can't it be?
Wonderful question. Why horses? Why horses? Well, there are very few kids who are afraid of horses in Jerusalem in 2019 because there aren't any horses. But if you want to know how the child chooses a symptom, see, that's an excellent question. What pieces make the horse the solution? And the answer is you never know. You never really know. What you can know is that it seems to work that way. Now, Freud was happy to have, you know, the father brought the kid, the kid had a dream, and it was about a giraffe, and the giraffe looked a bit like a father, and it was sort of phallic, and there was a mustache, and so there was a horse with a mustache, and so he could, you know, if you were Sherlock Holmes, you would play with the, play is an important word here, you'd play with the pieces and say, the horse reminds him of his father. Now, his father doesn't look like a horse, but there are a lot of horses out there, and then something else might have happened because it's like, you know, something reminds you of a taxi. Well, if you live in Jerusalem, so everything reminds you of a taxi, because no matter what thought you had, a taxi's going by. So that was what it was like in Vienna when always horses were going by, so that was an easy one to sort of attach to. But exactly how it happens, since it happened in the unconscious, it's hidden, and so you never actually know all the pieces. You can unpack it and then speculate about how it came about, but you never really know. That's one of the great advantages of psychoanalysis, that you're always in the dark. In other words, what you do in psychoanalysis, and some of this thinking, you'll see that family thinking and psychoanalytic thinking is not so far away, that when you're thinking in complex situations, you always say to yourself, I wish I could, see what you're asking is, I wish I could nail it, right? What does it mean to nail it? I can say, look, this is what happened. His mother said this, a horse went by, the horse had a mustache, or it had a muzzle that looked like a mustache, and then father showed up, and then he did, that would be to nail it. You can never nail it. In all of our work with human beings, you can never nail it. You can play with it, and playing it together with the client a lot of times makes it a lot better, but you can never nail it. And actually, that's not our role. Our role is not to know more than you can know. We need to settle for the tools that we have to be able to get indirectly the things that are helpful. That's about as good as it gets. So it's a sort of a hidden science, but that's how all human sciences are, except the ones that think that they're not, but they are too. They just think they're not. Yeah.
Let's take it one step even back. As you said, like when a new child is born, right, what does the older child say? Take the baby back to the hospital, right? So how did he get to that father?
How did he get to the father? He got to the father because the father was responsible for having this baby.
The child knows that the father is responsible for having the baby?
Because he was told that the father is responsible for having the baby. The father sees this baby and says, that's my baby. Right? Now, how exactly the father and the mother created the baby when the child is 4, if you ask 4-year-olds, it's very simple. It's, you see, mother had a big stomach. Now, how do you have a big stomach? At what age do children know that there are inner organs? See, the body looks like this on the outside, but when do they know that there are inner organs? The answer is 7. If anybody asks you a question about when do children know something about it, always say 7. It's a good guess. But in this case, it's because there's something in the brain that happens, you know, around 7. It's a well-known thing. But anyway, children don't know there are inner organs. They imagine sort of a flat, just like what it looks, because children accept the world as it looks. And they play with the pieces of what it looks like, but not the stuff they can't see. So here, mom has a big belly. And so how do people get big bellies? Or for example, when the baby says, when do I have a big belly? After I eat. Okay, so obviously mommy has eaten something that makes the baby in her belly. And for a 4-year-old, there isn't a womb. There's a belly. There aren't separate organs in there. And she got it from dad, so she must have eaten something from dad. What exactly? I don't know. Well, who's asking me? But that's the child's theory. But it can have to do with the father. Your question was, where does the father come in? Yeah. Right. But you see, being a child is a wonderful thing. But when you create childish solutions, see all of these neuroses, the whole idea of psychoanalysis is that neuroses are based on childish solutions. What does that mean? That you were faced with some problem that was emotionally beyond your ability to solve it. So what did you do? You made compromises. Now, it was beyond your ability to solve it because you were both small and alone. You see, one of the things that you've been asking about is, well, you can't talk to a 4-year-old? And the answer is 4-year-olds can talk like 7-year-olds when you talk with them, but they can't hold it by themselves. They can participate another developmental level beyond what they can actually do themselves. We'll get to that point later on. But so if you're talking to your 4-year-old and introducing ideas, a 4-year-old can participate with you, but they won't come up with it by themselves, right? So the 4-year-old, when they were alone, see, Hans's parents were not so good at talking to Hans and saying, listen, you know, these things happen and let's try to, they didn't help him. And so he had to do the compromise by himself. He got afraid of horses. One could say, this symptom is actually not a problem. It's actually a request for a solution. The symptom is a way of saying, I'm too small and too alone for something. Help! So they went to the wrong person. They went to Freud. There wasn't anybody else to go to. Even Anna Freud was 20 years before she started to see children. So they went to Sigmund Freud and he blew it. So far. He gets it right sooner or later. So the reason I say that is that a lot of times, if you look at psychoanalysis and say, what and exactly do you think you're doing, that, you know, talking to somebody who's lying on the couch? And the answer is taking something when this person was small and alone and reworking it now that they're big and not alone. That's what you do with adults in treatment, in general, not just in psychoanalysis. You take something that you were too small and too alone to resolve by yourself, and now that you're no longer small and you're not alone, you can come up with a different solution. That's what we do in treatment, okay? And you could also say to yourself, well, that's not going to work so well because the solution of the horses is a very good solution. It's a it's a brilliant solution. None of you in this room, I'm sorry to say, includes me, could come up with that solution. Only the unconscious can come up with these brilliant solutions to turn this into pretzels. But it's a brilliant solution. Why does the person want to let go of it? Huh? You'll be dealing with that for the rest of your lives from here on. Why does a person want to get better? They have a solution. What's called the suffering is a solution to something else, right? So it works in some way, and what we're looking at is that it seems to work in a lot of ways. And so it's not so easy to let it go. So far you've become complex thinkers, and you've been able to say that Hans is at 4 afraid of horses, and it has a 2x2 complication. There's 2 levels. There's the drives, and there's the drives, and there's the conscience, and the ego makes a compromise, and it all goes through the horses, right? Now, there's another level. What would that level be? Reality. Now, reality is that mom is spending a lot of time with Hannah. That's not a drive, that's a fact. Mom is busy with this baby, and she's a cute baby, and she's starting to walk, and she's, you know, taking a lot of attention. And so Hans would like to compete with Hannah, right? Now, what happens when he's neurotic, right? So who does he tell that he's afraid of horses? The answer is everybody, all the time. That's what you do when you're neurotic, right? So he gets up in the morning, says, I'm afraid of horses! And who comes and takes care of him? Everybody, all the time. In other words, that the symptom is also balancing something in reality. You could call it attention, or you could tweak that a little bit and say understanding, right? You know, when you say attention, we'll get to it in a few lectures, but when you say attention, it's sort of like, you know, just pat a dog, you know, pay attention. Children usually from the age of about 2 want a different kind of attention, which means to be attended to and understood. So when they say I'm afraid of horses, people like mom takes him into her bed and says, now, you know, horses are okay. So he's got a thing going with mom around what? The horses, right? And he's got a thing going with dad, who's going to the professor and taking the professor. Everybody's monkeying around with the horses. So this is a brilliant solution to reality. In other words, as long as you're afraid of horses, life is better, right? It's not perfect because you're afraid of horses and you can't go outside. But from the point of view of reality, reality has been improved. So there's another compromise, which is I want to be understood better. If I'm afraid of horses, people pay a lot of attention to my being afraid of horses. When I just don't want to eat breakfast, they don't pay any attention to me. But being afraid of horses works really well in reality. So now we have 3x2, right? You have a question?
Sorry, I'm not understanding the superego to the ego, superego
Sorry?
compromise.
What?
The compromise between the ego and the superego, I'm not.
The ego and superego? Listen, Hans, you're not going to be murdered. You're not going to be castrated. Boys tend to worry about that because there's an organ that's sometimes longer than it's sometimes shorter, and so it occurs to them that it could also not be there. And so, and if he has a sister, it occurs to him even more. So you're not going to be bodily harmed. You are just going to be, you're right to ask the question. You're going to be ill. See, being ill is half of being dead, or 1/60th of it. In other words, you are a sick boy. Sick isn't dead. It's a compromise. In other words, you can't go near a horse, you can't go outside, you're not having a whole lot of fun, but it's better than being killed, right? So being ill, the fact that you're being ill is like a punishment. And a lot of times you'll see that when people have an illness, an emotional illness, they see it in some ways as a punishment, and it's better than the other punishment. It could be worse, right? So that's the compromise.
And the superego is what's telling him that.
What?
The superego is what's telling him that?
No, the ego is saying, the superego, the conscience is saying, you deserve to die. That's what, you deserve to die. The ego says, but doesn't know that it's saying, how about being sick? Let's settle for being sick. The same as the compromise with the drives is, I want my mother to myself. Would you settle to have her pay attention to your being afraid of horses, right? Now, we did, okay?
Is this what you call secondary gain?
Say it again.
Is that where secondary gaining illness comes from?
I can't hear you.
Secondary illness, secondary gaining, July.
Okay, so secondary gain is not here. Secondary gain is another story. This is primary gain. It's primary. The question was, what about secondary gain? Have you all heard about secondary gain? Secondary gain is a term that's used to make you hate your patients, and it usually is very effective because you say that it's a term that helps therapists hate their patients because you say they're just manipulating. In other words, that you're not really ill, and all you're really doing is using the illness because you want to get attention, right? That's not a compliment.
It doesn't mean that they're not really ill.
What?
It doesn't mean that they're not really ill.
The use of the term secondary gain is that it's not really part of the illness. Secondary gain. Primary gain means that it's something that you gain within the compromise in the illness. Secondary gain is you like being paralyzed. You get something out of it. And it's a term that's problematic because it suggests that there's more control than there might be. So that's, you see the difference? Okay, that was an important question.
Try to turn this off because it's not too warm.
Is there a remote control?
Creating a lot of acoustic challenge.
Is there a remote control?
Cool. Thank you.
We're having a, see, it's a symptomatic air conditioner because it's a compromise between listening and not listening, and it's a compromise between passive and being active, right? So you can't give this lecture because I'm giving it, but you can take care of the air conditioner. So you see how it works. So now we have three levels of compromise, and now there's one more which is worth paying some attention to. This was not, what's it?
We're talking about how we've all become aware now.
It was our subconscious was bothering us.
Oh, okay. You can hear better now?
Yes.
So it's not a symptom. It's the ego saying, you know, we want to listen. Okay, no. I mean, that's the fact that you want to hear it. You know, you might have said, we need to turn up the air conditioner, right? And then go to sleep. So that's good. Now, there's one more level of compromise. Is this too much already, or is it? Am I turning you into pretzels? You'll see why we're doing it in a minute, but you haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
And let's go back to the beginning. The drive, the Oedipal drive.
Right.
It starts with something. That's an innate nature of every human being, or is that something that happens to this child?
Right.
That would cause triggered by something.
Right, so the question is Oedipus innate in all human beings? The answer is nothing is innate in all human beings. Freud saw a lot of it, but Freud was working in Vienna in 1890, 1900, 1910, and there was a lot of that there because of the structure of the family and because of male-female relationships and a lot of not understanding how to deal with children. Does it have to happen to everybody? No. Is it an element of what, let's say, children, what happened? It became, it ignited itself?
Yeah.
Right.
Wait, so he,
See, when psychoanalysis doesn't work, you pull the plug.
Yeah.
Right. So Freud saw a lot of it, but and by using the myth of Oedipus, he was suggesting that it might be an element of everybody's growing up. Does it create a neurosis in everybody? No, not at all. And as a matter of fact, one of Freud's understandings was, if you think about what I said before, that this is a challenge at the time when you have a younger sibling and you're alone and small. So if you're not alone, it's not going to happen because your ego will get the extra boost from what's called an auxiliary ego, known as a parent, who helps you to understand things more than you understand yourself. And so you're not alone and you're not so small. But if it's troubling you, it will go away when you get bigger. And one of these, it's like the milk teeth. It goes away at some point. In other words, you develop, and if you're not turned into a pretzel by it, see, the problem with the neurosis is the last thing we're going to get to, that it doesn't go away, right? But if you're not turned into a pretzel by it, it'll go away in time. And that probably in our days is the more natural way of doing it. But the question of, is there anything that is absolutely innate in human nature? It's better to assume not. Better to assume not. Because, as you know, in the 21st century, there's the great false promise that the genome is going to solve it all. I'm just going to get your genes, and I'm going to be able to read everything about you. It's not even coming close, and the reason it's not coming close is because of what's called epigenesis, right? Epigenesis is how you live, what happens, including what temperature it is. Because when the temperature is higher, certain enzymes work more, and they turn off certain genes. When the temperature is lower, other genes. So the genes by itself don't solve it all. So if the genes aren't going to solve it, then there's not going to be anything absolutely innate. But in any given society, and that's what you can use Freud as an example, you can, if you look at what's troubling people, it's sort of like a microcosm of the things that are not balanced in your society. And those things you can learn not just about this child, you can learn about society. Freud was not good at that. Freud was good at looking in the microscope. He liked microscopes. When he was a neurologist, he liked microscopes. But he wasn't good at generalizing to all of humanity, except for one pet peeve. He hated religion. And he hated religion from the age of 18, not from the age of, but he wrote 2 or 3 important books about how much he hated religion. And that's where you see Freud at his worst, because he was generalizing, but he wasn't looking at himself and what was it about him that he was expressing. So overall, it's better to look at people. You can use it as a microcosm, but you can't be so sure. If you have a zoom in and you start to zoom out, every time you do another level of zooming out, you're less sure. It's more fun, but you're less sure. I don't mind fun, but you don't want to confuse the fun with being sure. Zooming out is less sure than zooming in. So Freud was mainly zooming in. And there's one last, you're just scratching your head, okay. There's one last element of it which I want to tell you about, because it's important for the 21st century as well, and that is repetition. Now, Freud didn't know this when he was treating little Hans. This became clearer to him during the First World War. Hans, as a matter of fact, just missed the draft for the First World War. He turned 18 in 1918 when the war was over. And we'll get to that in a minute. But when Freud started to see soldiers coming back from the front in the First World War, the First World War was it had 2 aspects to it. The first is that it was the first war that was fought with automatic weapons. And as a result, 80% of the mortality was from automatic weapons, from the machine gun. There hadn't been machine guns before. And that made fighting into something very anonymous. You could be standing here, and something would be zapping at you from God knows where. You didn't see the face of your enemy. You weren't really fighting against anybody. And the same with, sitting in the trenches and being shelled. So there was an awful lot of shell shock in the First World War. Freud had 4 sons on the front, on the wrong side. He was Austrian, right? The other thing that you may be interested in is that probably the First World War was the first time that human beings fought without access to marijuana, to cannabis, because it had been part of culture until the British went crazy in Egypt and decided that it's a terrible, dangerous drug, and there was no cannabis available for the soldiers in the front. It's pretty clear in 2019 that cannabis is the best treatment for shell shock, but it took 100 years to free us to realize that. So Freud was seeing untreated shell shock, and he said to himself, well, now listen, I have this principle. You see, Freud was good at having principles and asking questions about his principles. One of the things you can learn from Freud is how to reflect on your own ideas. Freud changed his mind 3 times. You have to live a long time to do that, but he changed his mind a bunch of times on basic things. And one of the basic things he said, look, you know, the major principle is what's called the pleasure principle. People want to feel good, and that's what motivates them. For example, in the drives, so that's why, you know, you want to have mother to feel good, right? That's going to make you feel good. But these guys come back from the war, and they can't forget the shelling. They dream it, they think it, they remember it. That doesn't go together with the pleasure principle. That's what's known as beyond the pleasure principle, and that's the name of the book. In 1918, short book, brilliant book, and he said, I can't, no, it doesn't work. I can't explain things by the pleasure principle and look at shell shock. It doesn't work. There's some other principle involved. And the other principle that he thought was involved was the tendency for things to repeat, to go into loops and to repeat themselves. He gave it a, anybody here know anybody know German? Anybody know a little? Some yuccas here? Okay. Yiddish? A little bit more? Okay. And so Freud referred to it as the Wiederholenzwang. Wiederholen is to repeat, and Zwang is pressure, right? So Wiederholenzwang is what's called in English the repetition compulsion, but it just doesn't have the music, repetition compulsion. Wiederholenzwang. And the repetition compulsion, he said, is something innate. In other words, when things happen, they tend to just repeat themselves, and I have to accept that because I see it. It annoys the devil out of me because it messes up my theory of instincts, which I've been selling for 30 years. But I was wrong. I have to change my mind. What you change your mind about is not so important, but the fact that you can change your mind, that's, as we say, the best evidence that you have one. So, so he changed his mind, and he said there's this instinct for things to fall apart. There's an instinct for things to pull together. I called it libido. That was about the sexual part, but not just sexual parts. The tendency for things to pull together. One of the ways that things pull together is in sexual experience, but the tendency for things to pull together is one basic instinct, and the other one is the tendency for things to fall apart. Now, how does repetition have to do with falling apart? In the following way. When you are remembering the shelling, you can't do anything with it. You see, if you could do something with it, and some of you who've learned something about trauma treatment, that's what you do. You say, listen, let's go through it in slow motion. Let's not be alone about it. Let's add language. Let's add thinking. So you're putting something together with it, right? But the repetition compulsion is, it's like Teflon. It doesn't stick to anything, right? So it makes things fall apart in the sense that it can't be put as part of anything. It makes your experience of yourself fragmented. Because this, you see, what makes our experience of ourselves whole? That any piece, you can stick to some other piece, right? You can say, oh, I remember this, I remember that. I think of that, I thought of that, right? When you're remembering the shelling, you can't think of anything. So it doesn't stick to anything. You can't think about it, you can't talk about it. And so it's an experience of fragmentation. That's where the repetition, you got that? That's where the repetition is part of things falling apart. Now, yeah.
So like the things falling apart is it's attempting to come together.
That's right. The things that falling apart means it doesn't allow itself to stick and hold together with anything else. So the experience is something fragmentary that can't be put together. And Freud said, yeah.
So the tendency for things to fall apart, will that always be a traumatic experience because trauma causes the conscious to be able to stop, like there's no ability to connect?
Okay, the question was, what is the relationship, I'm changing your wording a little bit, between things falling apart and trauma? The answer is yes. That is exactly the definition of trauma. Trauma happens when you're alone and you can't think or talk. Right? In other words, what we say is something that overwhelms the defenses. What are the defenses? Thinking. You know, putting things together. Defenses are things that put things together. So when you have an experience that overwhelms those, you can't put it back together again without either some self-healing or help, right? So you could say from the point of view that Are things that fall apart trauma? Yes. Is trauma things that fall apart? Yes. Right? It's a very close and important relationship. And, you know, so as a result, you can imagine that when you learn about trauma treatment, what do you learn aside from using marijuana, which is very useful, that once people are treated with medical cannabis and are able to quiet down, you talk with them about what happened. You see, and they go through it in slow motion. What are they doing? They're collecting ego strengths, thinking, language, feeling, and putting it together with what didn't have any way to get together with it. And then it becomes, instead of I'm living in this trauma, I have a trauma that I remember, right? And that's the notion of healing. So repetition is part of what's going on. And now, when you're afraid of horses, so you're afraid of horses, and then you're more afraid of horses, and you're still afraid of horses, and tomorrow you're afraid of, it repeats itself, right? So every symptom has an element of repetition, and then the ego makes a compromise with the repetition, and instead of let's say everything repeating all the time, you confine it to let's just be afraid of horses. I'm afraid of horses, I'm still afraid of horses, same old, same old, same old afraid of horses, but nothing more than that. So not everything gets put into repetition, just the symptom itself, okay? So now, what would you call this, this map? This map was created, the name of the guy is Robert Velder. As you know, Velder means from the forest. So he's putting you into a thick, dark forest. Robert Velder, but Velder was not a psychoanalyst at first. He was an atomic physicist and was trained and worked at the Max Planck Institute. At the time, 1910s, 1920s, the origins of, anybody know some physics here? Quantum physics. What were the questions of quantum physics? The quantum physics began with reality is not so simple, right? In other words, when you say, for example, you know, this is electron. Well, now, give me a break. You can't treat the electron like a piece of matter because it acts like a piece of energy, but it also acts like a piece of matter. And you can't know at any time where it is and how fast it's going. It's impossible to know things. So the world suddenly becomes more mysterious, right? In other words, more complicated. You know, Newtonian physics, the apple falls in your head, you calculate it, and you're all set. But now we're after Einstein, and in quantum physics, the basis of matter starts to look like it's not matter at all. It starts to look like it's either empty or energy. And so, but that's how we live, you know. I'm looking at a bunch of, you know, energy collections here. Maybe for a serious yogi I would be, but no, you know, just see people. It looks like matter to me, right? So taking a different look at everything, much more complicated. This is quantum physics applied to psychoanalysis. In other words, what Robert Velder did is he said, you're afraid of horses? That's complex. It's not, what does it really mean? That's not a good question. What are the ways in which it means things? What's the collection of the ways? And what are, see, the compromises are not things. They're activities, they're energies. They're things that are done between one thing and the other. So we've created a mental world which is complex, and where you see mainly the activity of the person who's creating the symptom. There's somebody here who's done all of this and doesn't know that he's done any of it. That's our patient, right? That's this 4-year-old kid. So that gives you a different view. Would it be reasonable to say that this is in some ways a systems theory? It's an inner system, right? That there are different parts of the system, and they interact in different ways, and they create products that are complex and that are anything but obvious, right? In other words, you have to sort of see who's doing what with what in different parts in order to see it. Okay? Yeah.
With regards to ego to repetition, is that true? Because I feel like, let's say someone with a neurosis such as like OCD, it gets worse over time. It starts off with a fear of germs, and then it becomes a fear of people, and then it becomes a fear of, it's not just repetition, it becomes even more so.
So the question involves the T word. You asked if it's true. I don't know if it's true. And as a matter of fact, we're not going to learn many things here that we're going to stamp as it is true. But if you say, I have a different experience, and I don't know what to do with that and what you just said about repetition, because you said ODD? OCD. When you have obsessions, see, what are these loops? Obsessions, right? So it gets worse. Now, does OCD always get worse? Look at the literature. No. If you look at anxiety, depression, or OCD, you see that it divides a third. The natural history is a third, a third, a third. A third of the times it comes, it goes, and it's gone. A third of the times it comes, and it comes back every now and then. And a third of the time, it seems like you can't get rid of it. So you're asking about a third of it. What to do about that third? That's an interesting question. But we'll get to it in a second, and you'll see, among other things, that we don't know. In other words, and that, by the way, is useful for you to see. When somebody says it's something true, probably the answer is that that's an indicator, it's a marker that something isn't known. Right? In other words, you put your finger on something that we don't know. And so when you say is it true, it's like a wish that we could know something, because we can't. We don't know it. We're not dealing with things that are true here. We're dealing with things that are helpful to people. So now, if we have this system here, and we were to say, how about this reality? Does this reality work in the same way as the drives, the superego, and the repetition? That's a question that one of you might have asked. He said, you know, this is like apples and oranges. The drive is inside of me. The conscience is inside of me. The repetition is inside of me. The reality is outside of me. So why are we referring to that as in the same way? Well, if we open up reality, what you're going to discover is something called a family. Oh, now you see why we're doing all this? You're going to see where the family shows up in the meanings, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't the other meanings. All the other meanings also exist, and the family meanings exist, but they exist in a different way. You see, if we look at the results of the phobia, if we look at the drive, the superego, and the repetition, we're saying what's the origin of the origin of the phobia. And you know, if you were in the German-speaking country, that's what you wanted to know. You wanted to know the Ursprung. That was what every scientist was looking at, every philosopher, the origins, the Ursprung. But what goes on between the phobia and mom, because she says, oh, you poor Hans, you're afraid, come into my bed and all the word is to sort of fondle you. So that's not the origin of the phobia, that's the result of the phobia, isn't it, right? I mean, that's what happens after you have the phobia. Do you want to say that that's the cause of it? Or do you want to say it's a result of it? We have a different situation here in reality. So the mother is in bed with him and he has this, you know, whatever he has in his mind, this competition with the father. But he's also getting attention from the father, who, by the way, is blaming the mother for the whole thing. So it's your fault because you, and so forth. And then there's a professor, you know, that he gets dad to see the professor for this thing. And he takes Hannah's place in his mother's bed. So these things happen once you have the phobia. Would you like to say, Hans is a Novi. He knows in advance. He knows that he's going to get all these good results, and so the ego is this brilliant way of predicting things, and so the way the phobia is created is to get these things. You don't need to do that. It doesn't sound very robust, does it? To say, oh, the results are the same as the cause. How about if we separate results and cause? Then we're dealing with two different types of meanings. Two different types of meanings. They're not competing. They're two different sets of meanings. And we could call them the subjective meanings. The subjective meanings are the Ursprung. They're the things that we refer to as that's what caused the phobia. Subjective drive, subjective conscious subjective repetition. But the pragmatic meanings are the things that come as a result of the phobia. Okay? And now let's look and see how we can separate these two sets of meanings, because when we see a family, that's what we start to do. We start to say, how much do I know about what caused it, and how much do I know about what it's doing? Pragmatic comes from the Greek word praxis. Anybody here know Greek? Nobody here with a PhD in Greek? So I can make mistakes in Greek. So praxis means doing, actions. So let's look a look, for example, at how do we examine subjective meanings? What's our tool for examining subjective meanings? Well, we're going to look for hints, right? We have to look at things obliquely and for hints. So we do with Freud. We go and look for associations, and we look for dreams, right? We look for the imaginative world to give us hints about, did you imagine that your father had 4 legs and was stomping like a horse? Oh, that would be terrific, right? In which way would that be terrific? In understanding the subjective meaning of the symptom, and we're assuming the subjective meaning is what causes the symptom. We need to strip together these subjective meanings in those compromises in order to create the symptoms. So the subjective meanings are those. What about the pragmatic meanings? How are we going to see the pragmatic meanings? What should we do to see what the phobia is doing? Is the dreams going to help us? We have to observe. We observe. We can ask questions, but they're observational questions. We're not asking why, we're asking what happens. Okay, so then, Hans, you have this fear of your horses, and who do you go to? Oh, I go to my mother's bed. And when you go to your mother's bed, what does your father say? Your father says, get out of your mother's bed. And then what does he say to your mom? He says, you're making him worse by putting, oh, so now we're looking at a phobia that is doing something in the family, right? It's working its pragmatic meaning that has nothing to do with what created it. As a matter of fact, it may be contradictory to it, right? But that's what's happening in pragmatic meaning. So when you see a family and you ask a child, who's your favorite teacher? That's the best question to ask kids in school is, what's the subject you really hate the most? Then you can get to the other ones. But let's say you ask the kid, you passed that. He hates something. Who's your favorite teacher? He looks at his mother. Well, we're not finding out who his favorite teacher is, but we're finding out something about him and his mother, right? Are we asking him? No, we're observing it, okay? So all the time, we're dealing with subjective meanings and with observations, with pragmatic meanings, okay? Let's go on. What are the dynamics of the subjective meanings? Well, we just said for an hour, it's unconscious, right? In other words, it's something that you can't allow yourself to know. So if we say, how does Hans get this this symptom? We say he doesn't know, but we can collect, these hints about something that he's not ready to know. He's afraid to know. He makes a compromise because the ego says, I don't want to know about this business of father. I don't want to know this business of dying. So I make compromises. So the assumption is that the symptom is created by keeping something not known. Now, what about the pragmatic meanings? Are pragmatic meanings not known? If you say to Hans, what do you think your fear of horses does to your family? And let's give him 6, right? Is he going to know? He's not going to know. Is it repressed? Is it something that he knew or could know and then repressed, like the drives? It's something that he can't know, because the knowledge of what goes on in groups is partial, right? So that's not what's called the dynamic unconscious. Dynamic unconscious means that you sit on it, press it down, don't want to know about it, you're better off without it, right? In this case, it's not suppressed, it's not suppressed. It's something that it's preconscious. You just don't know about it. Some of you have done group treatments or group experiences. In a group, you really don't know what's flying, right? In other words, take a group even of 4 people, and you say, how much is each person aware of what his actions create in reactions to other people? The answer is, 5%, you know. And so you do the group therapy, it becomes 7%, you know. So you created something, but you're never aware very much of what's going on in a group or in a family. So what would be the difference? That when you say to Hans when he's 18, do you remember the horse thing? And he said, no, I don't remember any of it. So he doesn't want to remember it, right? He's repressed it. But if you ask him what's happening with your family, so he won't know the connection between the phobia and the family, but he knows what's going on in his family. He doesn't know the connections because it's partial. So you don't have to help him with psychoanalysis to overcome suppression. He's not repressing it. See, in psychoanalysis, you have to help people to stop repressing things. You have to make them feel comfortable, safe, not alone, bigger. Huh? In family therapy, when you say something like, well, I see that, you know, when you're afraid of horses, you get a lot of time in your mother's bed. You're saying something that nobody knew. It wasn't repressed, so you don't have to go through the anxiety of unrepressing something. You're able to observe things. For example, when Hans is 18, Freud meets him, and he puts an addendum to the case of little Hans, and he says, "What a success!" Right? Because Hans is a strapping young man. He looks fine. He's succeeding in the world, and he's even succeeded despite the fact that his parents divorced when he was 4. In other words, this was a success. It was a family failure. In other words, this was a family that needed to be treated as a family, because obviously the husband and the wife were fighting through this kid about something or other, and there was no family thinking. And so what was the result of the phobia? He got his parents to divorce. Now, that's nowhere in Little Hans, but the interesting thing is that when it shows up in the addendum, it doesn't make Freud stop for a second. He says, neat, look at that. He's managed to get along even though his parents divorced. What a wonderful treatment I've done. Instead of saying, ugh, you know, if I had understood what that was a family symptom, in other words, that there was a pragmatic meaning that I wasn't paying attention to, and the pragmatic meaning was more powerful than I thought it was. His parents ended up not being able to tolerate being with each other, probably partly because of the fights that they were having over Hans and his phobia. So he had a family phobia, which was looked at as a personal phobia. The pragmatic meanings were missed, and so it went. Now, how do you know what you know? Epistemology is the study of how we know knowledge. Episteme is knowledge in Greek, and epistemology is the way that we acquire knowledge. What we look at in subjective meanings is linear. This causes that, right? That's how we did it. We said he had a drive, he needed to make a compromise. We just gave this whole spiel. It's all linear. He had a bad conscience, he was afraid, we described how it takes place. That's true for subjective meanings. It's not true for pragmatic meanings. Pragmatic meanings are circular. Circular means that Hans is afraid of horses. He goes to his mother's bed. His mother brings him into bed. The father bellyaches. His mother throws him out of the bed. And then he's more afraid of horses, and then he goes into the mother's bed, and then the father says this, and he goes out of the bed. Same old, right? In other words, the cycle will tend to repeat itself. Pragmatic meanings are circular. You can't really identify where it starts. That's not the issue. The issue is how it works, not where it starts, okay? What is the function of the subjective meanings? It's an equilibrium, right? The balance, the compromise, that you have this feeling and that feeling, and this fear and that fear, You strip them all together and you create an equilibrium. And what is the function of the pragmatic meanings? Also an equilibrium. But it's an equilibrium between people, not inside a person, right? In other words, one could say that maybe in other hands, Hans's being afraid of horses would have had Freud prime say to the parents, what are you afraid of each other, right? And then Hans's being afraid of horses would open up the couple's issue, and they would talk about and come to a better equilibrium. In this case, that didn't happen, so the system, the function though is equilibrium, and that's why people don't give up their symptoms so fast, right? Because equilibrium is valuable, equilibrium is safe, and so if you give up a symptom, you're not being promised that life is going to be better. It might be a whole lot worse, right? So people come to us and say, please help me, parentheses, not to change, right? Please help me, parentheses, not to change. And the play between the not and the change depends on the client, but there's always an element of, I'm not so sure. You know, things, after all, we're getting along now, you could make it worse. So we are dangerous people. In other words, people come for help, they're already suffering, and the danger is we're going to make it worse before we make it better. And sometimes that's exactly what happens, because to let go of an equilibrium, or you could say in another way, that our clients are heroes, right? Because there's lots of suffering out there. Not everybody comes for treatment. Why do people not come for treatment? Because it's an equilibrium and it's safer. But the courageous people who come to us say, I'm willing to take a risk. I'm willing to forego equilibrium. It might be dangerous, but I'm willing to do it. So it's important for us to recognize the courageous part of anybody who comes for treatment, because they're coming to let go of equilibrium. And if they're coming as a family, it means that you're willing to let go of a family equilibrium in order to try to create something different. And so that gives us a lot of respect for them. It also might scare the daylights out of us, because it's a pretty big responsibility. So change is always going to be disequilibrium, but what would be the intervention? And here we'll stop for today. What do you do with subjective meanings? You interpret them, right? You say, there's more here than meets the eye, and we can use our subjective understanding to see where the compromises are. Do you see the compromises? No. So I'm going to help you to see the different pieces that created the compromises, and that will help your ego to make a better solution. You can actually make a solution instead of a compromise. So, but what do you need? Interpretation, right? You need to understand what you haven't understood about how this all happened. Does that help with pragmatic meanings? No. Pragmatic meanings are not interpreted. Pragmatic meanings are observed, and you try to help people to figure out what might work better. I'll give you a simple example, and then we'll get to the last question. What if Sigmund Freud had met J. Haley? J. Haley appears in the reading for, Haley wrote something called Modern Little Hands, which if you can read it for next time, we're going to take apart a family therapy case that's like Little Hands, and see how we would understand it from the family point of view and from our map point of view, right? Because it's not one or the other. And we're trying not to fall into simplistic choices here. But how would you do it? You would say to Hans, I'll tell you what, how about if at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you and your mother and your father, let's have Grandma take care of Hannah, and you and your mother and your father sit and look at horses. And everybody competes for how dangerous the horses are. Here's how it's going to be. Dad, you look at the horse and say, I'm afraid of that horse. And then he passes the book to Mom and says, I'm afraid of that horse. And then Hans says, I don't see why you guys are so afraid of horses, but all right, I'll play along. I'm afraid of that horse. Now, you're changing the meaning of being afraid of horses. You're changing the structure of it. You're putting people together in a different way. You haven't interpreted a thing, right? But you've made it a different pragmatic meaning. Instead of something that's hidden and compromises, it becomes family fun, right? Sphere of forces. So you see that would be a different way of looking at it. You'll see Haley in the case of little hands, and that's where we'll start next time. Next time we'll take apart little hands, we'll apply this for about an hour, and then get ready, because we're going to start to look at subjective and pragmatic meanings in your own families for an hour after this. One last question. Where was it? Yeah.
Regarding that intervention,
Right.
you were saying earlier that it doesn't necessarily help because if you're giving them the interpretation, but
Correct. Oh.
does it feel then if they come up with it themselves?
The question. Now this proves that somebody's been listening for 2 hours, so that's pretty amazing. I did indeed say before that you can't hand the interpretation over. Interpretation is a process. In other words, the interpretation is you have an interpretation, you help them to get to it. But if you just give it to them,
So in other words, basically psychodynamic theory tells us that if you help somebody come to an interpretation of their neurosis,
Right.
that is what the interpretation.
psychodynamic theory is, or psychodynamic, let's put it like on the ground, because it's not theory. Psychodynamic experience is that with many people, when you have an interpretation and you help them to get to it, when they're able to interpret the meanings of what they've been doing, they no longer do it. They become free of the symptoms. That's an experience which requires understanding. Is it a universal experience for all cases? Sorry, that's not the world we're in. But any time that anybody wants to ask me from the beginning of the session to the end, I'll be very happy. Okay, so next week.